During the reading of my dad's will, my brother said, "I'm getting the house, the business, and your wife. She left you for a better man." Everyone laughed until the lawyers said, "Actually, the company was never in his name. It was in." I just couldn't stop laughing at him. You know that feeling when you're sitting in a dentist's chair, waiting for the drill to hit a nerve? Yeah, that's exactly what this mahogany-paneled lawyer's office felt like, except instead of Novocaine, I got a front-row seat to my own public humiliation. The whole setup screamed fancy legal establishment, with its leather-bound law books that probably hadn't been cracked open since the Clinton administration, oil paintings of dead white guys in powdered wigs, and that smell. You know the one. A mixture of old money, stale coffee, and broken dreams. Mr. Harrison, our family lawyer who looked like he'd stepped straight out of a 1950s noir film, sat behind his massive oak desk shuffling through papers like he was dealing cards at a Vegas blackjack table. The man had been handling Wells' family business since before I could tie my own shoes, and honestly, watching him work was like watching a master craftsman. If that craftsman specialized in delivering life-altering bombshells with the emotional range of a GPS navigation system. But the real entertainment wasn't coming from Harrison's monotone reading of legal jargon. Oh no, that honor belonged to my dear brother Sebastian, who had apparently mistaken this solemn occasion for his own personal comedy special. Picture this: a guy who thinks he's God's gift to humanity, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, leaning back in his chair like he owned the place, which, according to him, he was about to. "I'm getting the house, the business, and your wife," Sebastian announced with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no in his entire privileged existence. "She left you for a better man." The way he said it, you'd think he was announcing the weather forecast or reading items off a grocery list. Just casual, everyday devastation delivered with a side of smugness that could choke a horse. And let me tell you, the peanut gallery ate it up like it was the best damn comedy show they'd seen all year. Aunt Marge, bless her alcohol-pickled heart, wheezed like a broken tea kettle having an asthma attack. The woman had been chain-smoking Virginia Slims since the Carter administration, so her laugh sounded less like human joy and more like a car engine that needed serious maintenance. Uncle Jerry, who'd apparently started his day with bourbon instead of orange juice, because nothing says family gathering like day drinking, nearly spilled his liquid breakfast all over his polyester pants. Even my soon-to-be ex-wife managed to plaster on that fake smile she'd perfected over our 7 years of marriage, the same one she used when pretending to enjoy my mother's dry Thanksgiving turkey or acting like she cared about my day at work. There I was, sitting in this overpriced legal circus, thinking to myself, well, isn't this just fantastic? Free comedy show, and I didn't even buy tickets. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was simultaneously the audience and the punchline of this whole twisted performance. It's like being invited to your own roasting and realizing you're both the guest of honor and the main course. Sebastian had always been the family's golden boy, the one who could do no wrong even when he was doing everything wrong. He had this way of making even his failures sound like strategic victories, like when he got kicked out of college for academic probation and spun it as taking time to explore entrepreneurial opportunities. Translation: he spent 2 years living in Dad's basement, ordering DoorDash with Mom's credit card and calling it market research. Meanwhile, there's me, the responsible one, the one who actually showed up to work every day, the one who knew the difference between profit margins and pizza margins. But somehow, in the grand theater of family dynamics, I was always cast as the supporting actor while Sebastian got top billing. It didn't matter that I'd been running Timberline Construction's day-to-day operations for the past 5 years while Sebastian was off, networking, at overpriced golf courses, and pretending that his Instagram followers constituted a business plan. The whole scene felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else through a fishbowl. Here's my brother, cracking jokes about my personal life imploding, while our extended family treated it like dinner theater. My wife, ex-wife, whatever, sitting there like she'd just won the lottery instead of trading one disappointment for another. Because let's be real here. If I was a fixer-upper, Sebastian was a condemned building with a fresh coat of paint. But then something beautiful happened. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. Not just a polite, excuse me, throat clear, but one of those dramatic, attention-commanding sounds that immediately shifts the energy in a room. I swear the temperature dropped about 20 degrees, like someone had opened a window to let in some harsh reality along with the cold air. The laughter died faster than Sebastian's last 3 business ventures, and suddenly everyone was paying attention to the man behind the mahogany desk. You could feel it in the air, that electric tension that comes right before everything you thought you knew gets turned upside down and inside out. Harrison had that look in his eyes, the same look a magician gets right before pulling a rabbit out of a hat. Except this rabbit was about to be a whole lot more surprising than anyone in this room was prepared for. Sebastian was still grinning like the cat who ate the canary, completely oblivious to the fact that he was about to become the canary. My ex-wife was probably already mentally redecorating the house she thought she was about to inherit through her brilliant strategic marriage upgrade. The aunts and uncles were settling in for what they assumed would be a predictable reading of a predictable will, where the favorite son gets the kingdom and everyone else gets the leftovers. But I could see it in Harrison's face, that slight twitch at the corner of his mouth that suggested this story was about to take a turn nobody saw coming. After 30 years of watching our family drama unfold, the old lawyer was about to drop the mic in the most spectacular way possible. And me? I just sat there, waiting for the other shoe to drop, because something told me that this comedy show was just getting started. Let me paint you a picture of Sebastian Wells, my dear brother, the man who single-handedly redefined what it means to be delusional. Imagine James Bond, suave, sophisticated, dangerously competent. Now imagine the complete opposite of that, but with triple the confidence and none of the self-awareness. That's Sebastian in a nutshell, or more accurately, that's Sebastian in an expensive designer nutshell that he probably put on his credit card. The guy had been living in what I like to call fantasy land since we were kids, but somewhere around his mid-20s, he upgraded to a deluxe fantasy suite complete with room service and a minibar. Sebastian genuinely believed he was this hotshot businessman, this master of industry, what's that word he loved throwing around? Oh right, synergy. He thought synergy was a personality trait, like being tall or having brown eyes. I'm really good at synergy, he'd tell people at parties, and somehow, they'd nod along like that actually meant something. Here's the thing about Sebastian that always killed me. He had this uncanny ability to make failure sound like a strategic victory. Take his living situation, for example. Most people would be embarrassed about crashing at their parents' place until they were 28, but not our golden boy. Oh no, Sebastian spun that into maximizing capital efficiency by minimizing overhead expenses. Translation: he was a grown-ass man eating Lucky Charms in his childhood bedroom while mom did his laundry and dad paid his car insurance. But the spray tan, Jesus, the spray tan. I don't know what self-respecting establishment was responsible for turning my brother into a walking Cheeto, but they should have been shut down by the health department. Sebastian strutted around Portland looking like he'd been dipped in bronzer, calling it his year-round vacation glow. The man lived in Oregon, where we see the sun approximately 15 days a year, but somehow he maintained this orange hue that would make a pumpkin jealous. He claimed it was part of his professional image, because apparently looking like a rejected Oompa Loompa was the key to business success. And don't even get me started on the clothes. Designer everything. Suits, shoes, watches, even his damn socks probably had some Italian name I couldn't pronounce. He'd walk into a room wearing more money than most people made in a month, but here's the kicker. None of it was actually his money. Credit cards, dad's emergency account, mysterious loans from equally mysterious sources. Sebastian was living a champagne lifestyle on a beer budget, and everyone just pretended not to notice. While I was actually working, you know, that thing where you show up somewhere every day and do stuff in exchange for money, Sebastian was busy networking. And by networking, I mean spending 3-hour lunches at overpriced restaurants, talking about potential deals that somehow never materialized, and attending business conferences that looked suspiciously like expensive vacations. He'd come home from these trips with a tan, adding to his already impressive orange collection, a bunch of business cards from people who probably forgot his name before their plane landed, and stories about all the connections he'd made. You wouldn't understand, he'd tell me whenever I asked about the practical details of his various ventures. You're too focused on the day-to-day operations. I'm thinking bigger picture, strategic planning, market positioning. Meanwhile, I was the one actually positioning the market. literally running timberline construction while he was off positioning himself at poolside bars in Scottsdale. The funniest part was watching him at actual business meetings. Sebastian would sweep into the room like he owned the place, throwing around buzzwords like confetti at New Year's Eve. Let's leverage our core competencies to maximize synergistic opportunities, he'd announced to a room full of contractors who just wanted to know if we could frame their office building on time and under budget. These poor guys would look at him like he was speaking ancient Greek, then look at me with this expression that clearly said, "Can you translate what your brother just said into English?" And I would, because that was my job, cleaning up Sebastian's messes, translating his corporate gibberish into actual actionable plans, and making sure our clients didn't run screaming into the arms of our competitors. While he was busy being a visionary, I was the one dealing with permits, payroll, safety inspections, and all the other boring stuff that actually keeps a construction company running. But in Sebastian's mind, he was the brains of the operation and I was just the guy who handled the paperwork. He'd introduce me to people as his operations manager, like I was some mid-level employee instead of the person who'd been keeping the lights on while he was off discovering himself in Bali or wherever the hell rich kids go to find their chakras these days. The worst part was how everyone bought into it. Dad would beam with pride whenever Sebastian talked about his latest business opportunity, while my actual accomplishments, like landing the Morrison Hotel contract or negotiating that sweet deal with the city for the waterfront development, got filed under "nice work, son. Now make sure the quarterly reports are ready for Monday." It was like being the invisible man at your own life story. Sebastian had this way of making everything sound more impressive than it actually was. A weekend in Vegas became an investor relations summit. Buying drinks for strangers at hotel bars became expanding our network of strategic partners. Getting kicked out of that casino for trying to count cards became exploring alternative revenue streams in the entertainment sector. The guy could have failed a pop quiz and somehow spun it into a teaching moment about the importance of challenging conventional educational paradigms. And the confidence, my God, the confidence. Sebastian walked through life like he had a personal soundtrack playing in his head, like he was the star of his own action movie where everything always worked out perfectly in the end. He'd stride into rooms, shake hands with people he'd just met like they were old friends, and somehow convince them that whatever half-baked idea he was peddling was the next big thing since sliced bread. But here's what really got me. Despite all the spray tan, designer clothes, and business school vocabulary, Sebastian had never actually built anything. Never closed a real deal. Never managed a team. Never had to explain to a client why their project was behind schedule or over budget. He was all sizzle and no steak. All talk and no walk. All style and absolutely no substance whatsoever. Growing up in the Wells household was like living in an alternate reality where effort was inversely proportional to recognition, and I was the star student in a class that nobody cared about. Picture this. 2 kids, same parents, same house, same opportunities, but somehow one of them gets treated like a golden retriever who learned to fetch beer while the other gets the neighbor's mutt treatment. Loyal, hardworking, but definitely not Instagrammable. Let me break down the Sebastian Appreciation Society for you, because this is where the whole twisted family dynamic really started. This kid could literally breathe, and Dad would throw him a parade. I'm talking full-blown celebration for basic biological functions. Look at Sebastian. He remembered to inhale and exhale today. Isn't he remarkable? Meanwhile, I could cure cancer and probably get a nice job. Son, now take out the trash in response. The report card situation was comedy gold, if you appreciate dark humor. Sebastian would waltz through the front door with a report card that looked like it had been graded by a drunk teacher having a bad day. C- in English, D+ in math, and somehow a B in PE, which, let's be honest, was probably because the coach felt sorry for him. But did Dad see academic failure? Hell no. Dad saw well-rounded potential and creative thinking outside the box. Sebastian got balloons. Actual balloons. Like he was turning 5 instead of failing the 5th grade. Me? I'd come home with a report card that looked like it should be framed and hung in the hallway. Straight A's across the board, honor roll, dean's list, the whole 9 yards. You know what I got? Nice work, son. Now mow the lawn. Not even a congratulations or a we're proud of you. Just immediate transition to chore assignment. Like academic excellence was just the baseline expectation and lawn maintenance was the real achievement worthy of discussion. It wasn't just grades, either. This pattern of Sebastian getting praise for existing while I got assignments for succeeding extended to every corner of our childhood. He'd help Mom in the kitchen by eating cookie dough and somehow become such a sweet boy who loves spending time with family. I'd actually cook entire meals from scratch. We're talking full three-course situations with appetizers and everything, and get asked why I didn't make enough for tomorrow's lunch too. The family gatherings were the worst. Picture every holiday, birthday, and random Sunday dinner turning into the Sebastian show, with the rest of us as unpaid extras in his personal documentary. Aunt Marge would coo over him like he was some exotic pet who'd learned to walk upright. Sebastian, tell us about your business ideas. Sebastian, you're so creative. Sebastian, have you been working out? Meanwhile, I could be standing right there holding the actual turkey I'd just spent 4 hours cooking, and someone would ask me to grab them another beer. Uncle Jerry was particularly bad about this. The man treated Sebastian like he was some kind of business prodigy from the time the kid could barely spell entrepreneur. Which, let's be real, he probably still can't. That boy's got vision, Jerry would say, usually while Sebastian was in the other room playing video games or trying to convince some girl on social media that he owned a yacht. Mark my words, he's going to be running his own empire someday. The irony is that Jerry was right about the empire part. Sebastian was definitely the emperor of his own little kingdom of delusion. But here's where it gets really twisted. When Dad actually needed help with the family business, guess who got the phone call? Spoiler alert, it wasn't Mr. Golden Retriever himself. When Timberline Construction was struggling with that disaster of a project on the east side, when permits were getting rejected and subcontractors were threatening to walk, when the whole thing was about to go belly up and take our family's reputation with it, Dad didn't turn to his precious Sebastian with all his vision and creative thinking. No, he called me at 2 a.m. Son, I need you to come in early tomorrow. We've got a situation. And just like that, I went from invisible lawn-mowing son to emergency business consultant, working 18-hour days to salvage a project that should have been managed properly from the beginning. Did I get credit when we pulled it off? Of course not. Dad just nodded and said, "Good work. Sebastian's got some ideas for the next project that might interest you." The school situation was equally ridiculous. I was juggling a full course load, working part-time at the hardware store to help pay for my own books and supplies, and somehow still finding time to help Dad with the business books on weekends. My schedule looked like a war strategy, color-coded, cross-referenced, optimized for maximum efficiency. I was running on about 4 hours of sleep and enough coffee to kill a small horse, but I was getting shit done. Sebastian's schedule looked like a vacation itinerary written by someone with ADHD and unlimited spending money. He'd roll into his classes whenever he felt like it, if he felt like it, treating college like an expensive country club that happened to have professors wandering around. He joined 3 fraternities, not because he was particularly social, but because he liked having multiple places to crash when he was too drunk to make it back to his actual dorm room. The family's reaction to our respective college experiences was perfectly on brand. Sebastian throwing keg parties and getting academic probation? Boys will be boys. He's just exploring his social side. Me graduating summa cum laude with a double major in business and construction management while working 2 jobs? That's nice, dear. Did you remember to send Sebastian some spending money? Even our career paths got the same twisted treatment. When I announced I was coming back to Portland to help grow the family business, to actually put my education to work building something meaningful, the family's response was lukewarm at best. That's practical, Mom said, like being practical was some kind of personality disorder. When Sebastian announced he was going to take some time to explore entrepreneurial opportunities, aka move back into his childhood bedroom and eat cereal for dinner, suddenly, he was this visionary taking calculated risks to maximize his potential. The whole thing was like living in some bizarre alternate universe where up was down, black was white, and failure was success as long as you had the right last name and enough charm to convince people that your complete lack of accomplishment was actually a sophisticated long-term strategy. 3 months before that circus performance in Harrison's office, I was sitting in one of those uncomfortable hospital chairs that seem specifically designed to make you question all your life choices while slowly destroying your spine. The smell of disinfectant and institutional cafeteria food hung in the air like a depressing cologne, and the only sounds were the rhythmic beeping of machines that were apparently the only things keeping my old man tethered to this world. Dad looked like a shadow of himself, which is saying something because Robert Wells had never been what you'd call a small man. This was a guy who could intimidate a building inspector with nothing but a hard stare and a firm handshake, who'd built timberline construction from nothing but a pickup truck, a toolbox, and enough stubborn determination to move mountains, literally, in some cases. But lying there in that hospital bed, hooked up to more wires than a NASA space launch, he looked fragile in a way that scared the hell out of me. The cancer had been brutal, the kind that doesn't mess around with polite negotiations or gradual surrenders. It just moved in like a hostile takeover and started liquidating assets. Dad had fought it the same way he'd fought everything else in his life, with grit, determination, and a complete refusal to acknowledge that some battles can't be won through sheer force of will. But even Robert Wells had his limits, and we'd reached them about 3 weeks earlier when the doctors started using phrases like making him comfortable and spending quality time. Now, my dad wasn't exactly the warm and fuzzy type. He'd never been one for heart-to-heart conversations or emotional bonding moments. His idea of showing affection was teaching you how to properly use a circular saw without losing any fingers, and his version of life advice usually came in the form of construction metaphors. Measure twice, cut once wasn't just carpentry wisdom in our house. It was basically the Wells family motto. But that particular afternoon, something was different. Dad kept looking at me with this expression I'd never seen before, like he was trying to memorize my face or maybe seeing me clearly for the first time in years. It wasn't the usual "good job, son, now get back to work" look. This was deeper, more complicated. The kind of look that carries weight and history and maybe a little bit of regret. "You know," he said, his voice hoarse from the treatments and the morphine. "Sebastian's always been the charming one." He paused to cough, and I could see it cost him energy he didn't really have to spare. Kid could sell ice to Eskimos, snow to Minnesota, you name it. People just like him. Always have. I nodded, not sure where this was going but sensing that interrupting would be a mistake. Dad wasn't much of a talker on his best days, and these definitely weren't his best days. "But charm doesn't build houses," he continued, fixing me with that intense stare that had intimidated contractors and city officials for 3 decades. "Charm doesn't read blueprints or manage payroll or deal with the nightmare that is Oregon's permitting process. Charm is nice to have, but it's not what keeps the lights on." The way he said it hit me like a ton of bricks, no pun intended. This was the closest thing to an acknowledgement I'd ever gotten from him that he actually saw what I'd been doing all these years. All those 18-hour days, all those crisis management sessions, all those times I'd saved projects that Sebastian had almost tanked with his innovative approaches. Dad had been paying attention after all. But then his eyes drifted over to the corner of the room, where his old leather briefcase sat on the visitor's chair like some kind of ominous prop from a spy movie. That briefcase had been Dad's constant companion for as long as I could remember. Beat-up brown leather that had seen more construction sites than most hard hats, covered in scratches and stains that told the story of 30 years in the building trade. The thing about that briefcase was that it was Dad's holy grail, his inner sanctum, his personal Fort Knox. Nobody touched it, nobody looked inside it, and God help you if you even suggested that maybe it needed to be organized or updated for the digital age. It was off limits to everyone, including Mom, including the accountants, and especially including Sebastian, who'd been trying to get his hands on it since he was old enough to understand that important papers lived inside important-looking cases. "That briefcase," Dad said, like he was reading my mind, "has everything. Contracts, agreements, ownership documents, the real stuff that matters. Not the shiny presentation folders your brother likes to wave around at meetings. The actual paperwork that determines who owns what and who's responsible for what." He looked back at me with that same intense expression. "Sebastian's never been allowed near it." "You know what?" I shook my head, even though I was starting to get a pretty good idea. "Because Sebastian thinks business is about making impressions and closing deals and all that smooth-talking bullshit they teach in those fancy MBA programs. But real business, the kind that actually works, is about details. It's about reading the fine print, understanding the contracts, knowing exactly what you're signing and why you're signing it. Dad's voice was getting stronger, like talking about business was giving him energy. Your brother's great at the song and dance, but he's never bothered to learn the actual music. The way Dad kept glancing at that briefcase was starting to make sense. It wasn't just paranoia or old-fashioned secrecy. It was strategy. Every time Sebastian had tried to get involved in the important business decisions, Dad would redirect him toward the flashier, more visible stuff. Marketing meetings, client lunches, ribbon-cutting ceremonies. All the parts of running a business that looked impressive but didn't actually involve any real power or control. Meanwhile, I'd been getting the behind-the-scenes education. Contract negotiations, legal reviews, financial planning, risk assessment. All the boring, unglamorous stuff that Sebastian couldn't be bothered with because it didn't come with photo opportunities or networking events. I know you think your brother gets all the attention, Dad said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Hell, maybe he does. But attention and respect are two different things. And trust. He fixed me with that stare again. Trust is something else entirely. At the time, I thought he was just trying to make me feel better about always being the responsible one while Sebastian got to play the golden child. I figured the briefcase comments were just Dad being protective of his business documents, the same way he'd always been protective of his tools and his truck and his reputation. But looking back now, sitting in that lawyer's office 3 months later, I realized Dad hadn't been having a sentimental moment at all. He'd been setting the stage for the most epic mic drop in Wells family history. So there we were, back in that mahogany-paneled chamber of family dysfunction, where the air was thick with tension and the scent of expensive cologne mixed with cheap desperation. Everyone was still riding high on Sebastian's comedy routine about my wife upgrading to a better model, namely him. The family peanut gallery was having themselves a grand old time, probably thinking this was the most entertaining reading they'd ever attended. Hell, Aunt Marge was still wheezing like a broken accordion, and Uncle Jerry looked like he was about to order another round of bourbon even though it wasn't even noon yet. Sebastian was absolutely glowing, and I don't just mean from his latest spray tan session. The guy was practically vibrating with smug satisfaction, like he'd just won the lottery, the Super Bowl, and a Nobel Prize all in the same morning. He had that look on his face, you know the one, like a cat who'd not only caught the canary but also figured out how to open the cage, eat the bird food, and convince the other cats that he'd done them all a favor. My soon-to-be ex-wife was sitting there trying to look dignified while simultaneously calculating how much the house was worth and whether she'd be able to redecorate it in that awful shabby chic style she'd been obsessing over since her book club started watching those home improvement shows. She kept smoothing down her skirt and checking her lipstick in her phone camera, like she was preparing for her close-up as the new Mrs. Sebastian Wells, First Lady of Delusion. And me? I was just sitting there like the world's most patient audience member, waiting for this train wreck to reach its inevitable conclusion. Part of me was genuinely impressed by Sebastian's performance, the sheer audacity of announcing that he was getting everything, including my wife, like he was reading items off a grocery list. Let's see, I need milk, eggs, bread, a construction company, and my brother's marriage. Yep, that covers it. But then something beautiful happened. Mr. Harrison, our family lawyer who'd been sitting there like a statue while Sebastian performed his one-man show, slowly removed his reading glasses and cleaned them with the methodical precision of a man who was about to change everyone's day. The gesture was so deliberate, so theatrical, that it immediately commanded attention. Even Sebastian stopped basking in his imagined glory long enough to notice that the room had gone quiet. Harrison put his glasses back on and looked directly at Sebastian with the kind of expression you'd use to explain basic math to a particularly slow kindergartner. Actually, he said, and that one word dropped into the silence like a bomb with a very long fuse. The business was never in his name. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. Hell, you could have heard a pin thinking about dropping. The laughter died faster than Sebastian's last 3 business ventures combined, and suddenly everyone was paying very close attention to the man behind the mahogany desk. Even the traffic noise from outside seemed to quiet down, like the entire city of Portland was holding its breath to see what came next. Sebastian's face went through more changes than a traffic light having an identity crisis. First there was confusion, that blank, deer in the headlights look that meant his brain was still trying to process what he'd just heard. Then came the dawning realization that something wasn't going according to his carefully constructed fantasy. And finally, there was this beautiful moment of pure panic as he started to understand that maybe, just maybe, he didn't know as much about Dad's business arrangements as he'd assumed. "What do you mean it was never in his name?" Sebastian stammered, and for the first time since we'd walked into that office, he didn't sound like the smooth-talking master of the universe he'd been pretending to be. He sounded like exactly what he was, a guy who'd been so busy polishing his image that he'd never bothered to look at the actual paperwork. Harrison consulted his documents with the unhurried precision of a man who'd been practicing law since before Sebastian was born. "The business was transferred years ago," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of satisfaction. "Ownership was quietly moved to ensure proper succession and management continuity. Your father was very specific about his intentions." The room was so quiet you could practically hear everyone's hearts beating. Diane, my stepmother, looked like she was about to faint. Uncle Jerry's bourbon glass was frozen halfway to his lips. Aunt Marge had stopped wheezing entirely, which was probably the first time she'd been silent since the Clinton administration. Even my ex-wife looked confused, like someone had just told her that gravity was optional and she wasn't sure whether to believe it. But Sebastian was having what you might charitably call an existential crisis. The golden boy who'd spent his entire life assuming that charm and good looks and family connections would carry him through anything was suddenly face to face with the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he'd been playing the wrong game this entire time. "So who?" Sebastian's voice cracked like he was going through puberty all over again. "Who owns the business?" And that's when Harrison delivered the knockout punch with all the drama of a seasoned courtroom veteran. He looked over his glasses, paused for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 3 seconds, and said the magic words that I'd been waiting my entire life to hear. "The owner is." The suspense was killing me, and I was the one who supposedly knew what was coming. My heart was pounding like I'd just run a marathon, and I could feel this ridiculous grin starting to spread across my face even though I was trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. This was it, the moment when Dad's master plan finally came to fruition, when all those years of being treated like the invisible son while Sebastian got the royal treatment would finally make sense. Sebastian looked like he was about to throw up, which would have been hilarious except that it would have ruined the expensive carpet. My ex-wife was gripping her purse like it contained the last life preserver on the Titanic. The extended family looked like they were watching their favorite TV show get canceled in real time. And me? I couldn't stop laughing. Not the polite, social kind of laughter you do at dinner parties when someone tells a moderately amusing story. This was the deep, belly-shaking, tears-in-your-eyes kind of laughter that comes from watching 30 years of cosmic injustice get corrected in real time. The kind of laugh you do when karma finally shows up to the party fashionably late, but dressed to kill. You know that moment when you're watching a magic trick and you can see the exact second the volunteer realizes they're not the assistant, they're the rabbit about to disappear? That's exactly what was happening to my soon-to-be ex-wife, Amanda, as she sat there in that leather chair, probably wondering if she'd made the biggest strategic error of her life. The woman who'd spent the last 6 months treating our marriage like a sinking ship she needed to abandon before it took her down with it was suddenly looking a lot less confident about her life raft choice. Amanda had always been what you might politely call a strategic thinker, and by that I mean she approached relationships like a corporate merger analyst looking for the best possible return on investment. When we first met, I was the safe choice, stable job, decent prospects, family business connections, and just enough ambition to suggest I might eventually be worth something. I was her Toyota Camry. Reliable, practical, not particularly exciting, but guaranteed to get her where she needed to go without breaking down on the highway. But Sebastian? Oh, Sebastian was supposed to be her Tesla upgrade. Sleek, impressive, expensive-looking, and guaranteed to make all her friends jealous at country club brunches. The fact that Teslas have a tendency to randomly catch fire or leave you stranded on the side of the road with a dead battery apparently hadn't factored into her calculations. She'd been so dazzled by the shiny exterior that she'd never bothered to pop the hood and see what was actually under there. The transformation in Amanda over the past few months had been something to behold. One day we're discussing vacation plans and whether to refinish the hardwood floors, and the next day she's suddenly finding herself and exploring new possibilities and realizing that we've grown apart. Translation: she'd gotten a good look at Sebastian's Instagram account and decided that a life of designer handbags and exotic vacations was worth trading up for. The divorce proceedings had been about as amicable as a corporate hostile takeover, with Amanda's lawyer, some shark in $1,000 suit who probably charged by the syllable, making it clear that she expected to walk away with half of everything, including half of my stake in what she assumed would eventually be Sebastian's construction empire. She'd done her homework, or thought she had, mapping out the Wells family financial landscape like she was planning a military campaign. I deserve to be with someone who appreciates my potential, she told me during one of our final conversations, sitting in what used to be our kitchen, sipping coffee from what used to be our matching mugs. The irony of talking about potential while leaving me for a guy whose biggest accomplishment was maintaining an even spray tan was apparently lost on her. But now, sitting in Harrison's office, watching Sebastian's confidence evaporate like morning dew in the desert, Amanda was starting to look like someone who'd just realized she'd sold her Apple stock right before the iPhone was announced. The woman who'd been so sure she was upgrading to first class was beginning to suspect she might have actually downgraded to the cargo hold. I couldn't help myself. The opportunity was just too perfect, too beautifully served up on a silver platter. I leaned over toward her, close enough that only she could hear, and whispered, "Hope you kept the receipt." The look on her face was absolutely priceless, part confusion, part dawning horror, and part desperate hope that maybe she was misunderstanding the situation. Amanda had always prided herself on being able to read people, on understanding the social dynamics of any room she walked into. She was the type who could size up everyone at a dinner party within 5 minutes and know exactly who was worth cultivating and who was worth ignoring. But apparently, she'd been so focused on reading the surface-level family dynamics, Sebastian the golden boy, me the reliable workhorse, that she'd completely missed the undercurrents. The woman had spent months positioning herself as Sebastian's perfect partner, showing up to family gatherings on his arm, laughing at his jokes a little too loudly, making sure everyone knew she was available for upgrade. She'd even started dressing differently. More expensive clothes, more elaborate hairstyles, the kind of high-maintenance look that suggested she was preparing for a lifestyle that required professional photography. At Christmas dinner, she'd practically ignored me while hanging on Sebastian's every word about his latest venture capital opportunity or disruptive business model. She'd nodded along while he explained his plan to revolutionize the construction industry through synergistic partnerships and innovative workflow optimization, like she was listening to Steve Jobs unveil the next iPhone instead of watching my brother try to make "I have no idea what I'm doing" sound like a business plan. The funniest part was watching her try to fit into Sebastian's world of expensive restaurants and networking events. Amanda had grown up solidly middle class. Her dad was a high school principal and her mom taught kindergarten, but she'd spent the last few months trying to reinvent herself as some kind of socialite. She'd started using words like summering and wintering like she'd been born into old money instead of growing up in a split-level ranch house in Beaverton. But now, as the reality of the situation started sinking in, I could see her mentally recalculating everything. The designer clothes suddenly looked less like smart investment pieces and more like expensive mistakes. The plans for redecorating their house were evaporating like smoke in the wind. The carefully constructed image of herself as the wife of a successful businessman was crumbling faster than Sebastian's fake confidence. Aunt Marge, bless her alcohol-preserved heart, actually snorted into her tissue when I made my receipt comment. The old broad had never liked Amanda anyway. She'd always thought my ex-wife was too calculating, too focused on appearances, too much like the type of woman who'd leave her husband for his more successful brother. Turns out Aunt Marge was a better judge of character than I'd given her credit for. Amanda shifted uncomfortably in her chair, probably running through her options like a chess player who'd just realized she was 3 moves away from checkmate. She could try to salvage things with me, but that ship had sailed when she decided to make our divorce proceedings more hostile than a congressional hearing. She could stick with Sebastian and hope this was all some kind of misunderstanding, but even she wasn't delusional enough to ignore the writing on the wall. The woman who'd thought she was trading up from reliable transportation to luxury sports car was beginning to understand that she might have actually traded her Toyota for a lemon that looked good in the showroom, but was going to leave her stranded on the side of the road. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when an entire family realizes they've been betting on the wrong horse for 30 years, let me paint you a picture. It's like watching a group of investors suddenly discover that their blue-chip stock was actually just elaborate monopoly money. Except instead of losing their retirement funds, they were losing their carefully constructed worldview about who mattered in the Wells family hierarchy. The panic started with Diane, my stepmother, who'd married into this family circus about 10 years ago and had spent every holiday since then treating Sebastian like he was some kind of business prodigy destined for greatness. Diane was one of those women who'd read too many self-help books about manifesting success and visualizing abundance, and she'd apparently visualized Sebastian running a construction empire while wearing designer suits and driving luxury cars that he'd definitely earned through his own merit and not through family connections. Now, Diane said, her voice taking on that artificially calm tone that people use when they're trying to convince themselves that everything is fine while the house burns down around them. I'm sure there's been some kind of mistake. Sebastian will still find a way to make this work. He's always been such a natural leader. She looked around the room like she was seeking confirmation from a jury that was clearly not buying what she was selling. Natural leader? The only thing Sebastian had ever led was a conga line at that disastrous company Christmas party 3 years ago, and even that had ended with him tripping over a potted plant and taking out half the accounting department. But Diane had this remarkable ability to rewrite history in real time, turning Sebastian's failures into character-building experiences and his complete lack of business acumen into thinking outside the box. Uncle Jerry, meanwhile, was having his own crisis of faith. This was a man who'd been treating Sebastian like the heir apparent to some kind of construction dynasty, probably imagining himself as the wise advisor to the future king of concrete and lumber. Jerry had spent years boring everyone at family gatherings with his theories about Sebastian's executive potential and his natural instincts for deal-making, conveniently ignoring the fact that Sebastian's idea of deal-making was convincing bartenders to give him free drinks. Maybe we should think about selling the house, Jerry muttered into his bourbon, apparently deciding that if Sebastian wasn't going to inherit a business empire, they might as well start liquidating assets to cover what he euphemistically called Sebastian's business expenses. And by business expenses, he meant the small fortune Sebastian had blown on cryptocurrency investments that had about as much substance as his spray tan, and those networking retreats in Bali where the only thing he'd networked was his liver with various tropical cocktails. The extended family was scrambling like passengers on a sinking cruise ship, suddenly realizing that their first-class accommodations might not be worth much if the whole vessel was going down. Cousin Mike, who'd been sucking up to Sebastian for years in hopes of getting some kind of job in the family business, was now looking around the room like he was calculating his chances of switching sides before it was too late. His wife, Sarah, was frantically texting someone, probably her mother, filling her in on the family drama in real time, like she was providing live commentary on a sporting event. But the real entertainment was watching them try to process the fundamental shift in family dynamics that was happening right before their eyes. For years, they'd all operated under the assumption that Sebastian was the golden goose, and I was just the guy who kept the goose fed and clean. They'd invested so much emotional energy in treating him like royalty and me like the help that they couldn't just flip the script without some serious psychological whiplash. Aunt Marge, who'd spent decades cooing over Sebastian like he was her favorite grandchild instead of her nephew, was now looking at me with this expression of dawning recognition, like she was seeing me clearly for the first time in 30 years. "Well," she wheezed, "I always knew you were the smart one, dear. Always knew you had good sense." The speed with which she was rewriting her own history was actually impressive. Within the span of about 30 seconds, she'd gone from Sebastian's biggest cheerleader to my long-lost supporter. The beauty of it all was watching them realize that they'd been extras in someone else's movie this whole time. Dad had been directing this whole production from behind the scenes, letting them all believe whatever they wanted to believe while he quietly arranged the pieces on his chessboard. They'd thought they were watching Sebastian's triumphant rise to power, but they'd actually been watching the setup for his spectacular fall from grace. I sat there enjoying the free reality show, feeling like I had front row seats to the best entertainment I'd seen in years. This was better than Netflix, better than cable TV, better than any sitcom that had ever been written. The pure chaos of watching an entire family realize they'd been wrong about everything for decades was the kind of schadenfreude that money can't buy. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel like the responsible but unremarkable son who was good for handling crises, but not worth celebrating. I felt like the main character in my own story instead of the supporting actor in Sebastian's epic fantasy. Every shocked face, every desperate attempt to reframe the situation, every panicked whisper was validation that I'd been right about everything. Sebastian was all flash and no substance, and everyone had finally been forced to confront that reality. The funniest part was that they were all trying to figure out how to position themselves for this new reality without admitting that they'd been completely wrong about the old one. It's like watching politicians try to explain why they suddenly support the opposite of everything they believed last week. Lots of creative language and strategic memory loss, but nobody wanting to admit they'd been playing for the wrong team this entire time. Uncle Jerry was now muttering about how he'd always had concerns about Sebastian's approach to business, conveniently forgetting that he'd been Sebastian's biggest hype man for the better part of a decade. Diane was suddenly remembering all the times she'd noticed my work ethic and business sense, despite having treated me like furniture for years. Even Cousin Mike was nodding along like he'd been team protagonist all along, which was rich considering he'd spent the last 5 Christmases trying to get Sebastian to hire him for some made-up consulting position. You know that moment in courtroom dramas when the underdog lawyer suddenly pulls out the evidence that changes everything? That folder full of documents that proves the defendant was actually innocent all along, or the smoking gun that reveals who really committed the crime. Well, this wasn't a courtroom drama. It was a family circus, but I was about to have my big legal thriller moment anyway. And let me tell you, it felt better than winning the lottery and getting revenge on your high school bully at the same time. I'd been sitting there watching my family scramble around like chickens with their heads cut off, desperately trying to rewrite history and reposition themselves for whatever this new reality was going to look like. But while they were all busy panicking and making excuses, I was thinking about the manila folder I'd brought with me, the one sitting innocently next to my chair like a briefcase full of dynamite waiting for the right moment to explode. See, here's the thing about being the responsible one. The one who actually shows up and does the work while everyone else is busy taking credit or making excuses. You develop habits. Good habits. Like keeping records. Like saving documents. Like maintaining files that prove exactly what you've been doing and when you've been doing it. Some people might call it anal retentive. I prefer to think of it as professional documentation with a side of covering your ass. For 5 years, I'd been watching Sebastian waltz into meetings and take credit for deals I'd closed, projects I'd managed, and problems I'd solved. For 5 years, I'd listened to him tell people about his business strategies and his client relationships while I sat there like a human tape recorder, mentally noting every lie, every exaggeration, every complete fabrication. And for 5 years, I'd been keeping receipts, literally. So when the moment felt right, when Sebastian was looking at me like a deer in headlights and the family was in full panic mode, I reached down and picked up my folder. It wasn't much to look at, just a standard manila folder, maybe 2 inches thick, the kind you can buy at any office supply store for about 50 cents. But inside that folder was 5 years' worth of ammunition, meticulously organized and ready to detonate. You know what? I said, standing up and enjoying the way everyone's attention immediately shifted to me. For once in my life, I was the center of attention in a room full of Wells' family members, and I was going to savor every second of it. I think this might be a good time to clear up some confusion about who's been doing what around here. I slammed the folder down on Harrison's mahogany table with the kind of dramatic flourish that would have made a TV lawyer proud. The sound echoed through that fancy office like a judge's gavel, and I swear everyone in the room jumped a little bit. Even Harrison looked impressed, and the man had probably seen more family drama than a soap opera writer. See, unlike my brother, I said, opening the folder and revealing its contents to the room, I keep receipts, and not just from Gucci outlets. The dig at Sebastian's shopping habits landed perfectly. He flinched like I'd slapped him, and Amanda looked like she was about to crawl under her chair and hide. The folder was a thing of beauty, if you appreciate the aesthetics of organized revenge. Every contract I'd negotiated was in there, organized chronologically and cross-referenced by project. Every client meeting I'd attended, every permit I'd obtained, every crisis I'd managed. It was all documented with the kind of obsessive detail that would make an accountant weep with joy. Morrison Hotel renovation, I said, pulling out the first set of documents. 18-month project, $2 million budget, completed 3 weeks early and under budget. Client specifically requested to work with me again. I looked directly at Sebastian, who was turning an interesting shade of green that didn't match his spray tan at all. Funny thing is, I remember you telling people at Aunt Carol's birthday party that you'd personally overseen this project. Must have been some kind of out-of-body experience, considering you spent most of those 18 months in Cabo. The room had gone dead quiet. Even Aunt Marge had stopped wheezing, which was probably the first time she'd been silent since the Bush administration. My cousin dropped his latte, actually dropped it, not just set it down, and the sound of the cup hitting the floor was like a gunshot in the silence. Waterfront development project, I continued, flipping to the next section. 15-unit luxury condominiums, $3.5 million contract. Signed by me, managed by me, delivered by me. But I distinctly remember Sebastian taking all the credit at that Chamber of Commerce dinner. I pulled out photographs, actual photographs of me at the job site, wearing a hard hat and safety vest, clearly overseeing construction while Sebastian was nowhere to be found. Uncle Jerry was staring at the documents like they were written in hieroglyphics, probably trying to process the fact that everything he thought he knew about the family business was apparently complete fiction. Diane was doing that thing where she pretends to study her fingernails when she's uncomfortable, but I could see her stealing glances at the folder like it contained nuclear secrets. Pine Ridge Elementary School expansion, I said, really hitting my stride now. Remember that one, Sebastian? The project where the city almost pulled our permits because of communication issues with the primary contractor? The same project you told everyone you'd save through your diplomatic skills and relationship management? I pulled out a stack of emails, printed and highlighted for maximum impact. Turns out, the city has very detailed records of who actually fixed those communication issues. Spoiler alert, it wasn't you. Sebastian was now looking like he'd swallowed a live fish. His usual smooth-talking confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by this deer-in-headlights expression that would have been hilarious if it wasn't also kind of sad. The golden boy was finally being forced to confront the reality that his entire reputation was built on other people's work. Oh, and this one's my favorite, I said, pulling out the final section. Remember when Dad was in the hospital last year, and Timberline almost lost the Peterson contract because of scheduling conflicts? Sebastian told everyone he'd stepped up to handle the crisis while I was dealing with personal issues. Turns out, I have the phone records, email chains, and signed agreements that show exactly who was working 18-hour days to save that contract while someone else was posting Instagram stories from a resort in Scottsdale. Mr. Harrison was leaning back in his chair with what I could swear was a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The man had been handling Wells' family business for decades, and he'd probably been waiting years to see someone finally call Sebastian out with actual evidence instead of just complaints and hurt feelings. 3 weeks after the Great Will Reading Massacre, I was sitting in my new corner office, the one that used to be Dad's, with the big windows overlooking the construction yard and a view of downtown Portland that made me feel like I was on top of the world. The mahogany desk that had intimidated me as a kid now felt like it belonged to me, and the leather chair that Dad had occupied for 30 years was finally being put to good use by someone who actually understood what the hell they were doing. I was reviewing expansion contracts for our new Beaverton project when my assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Wells? There's someone here to see you." Well, he says he's your brother." The way she said it, with that careful diplomatic tone that suggested she wasn't quite sure how to handle this particular visitor, told me everything I needed to know about Sebastian's current state. "Send him in," I said, leaning back in my ergonomic chair and trying to contain my excitement. This was going to be better than cable TV, better than a pay-per-view boxing match, better than watching a nature documentary about predators finally catching their prey. Sebastian Wells, the golden boy himself, was about to walk into my office as a supplicant instead of the heir apparent he'd always assumed he'd be. When he walked through that door, I almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the designer suit, replaced by wrinkled khakis and a polo shirt that looked like it had been rescued from a clearance rack. The spray tan had faded to a patchy orange that made him look like a jack-o'-lantern left out in the rain for too long. His hair, usually perfectly styled with whatever expensive product he'd been using to maintain that "I'm successful and you're not" look, was disheveled and hanging limply around his face like wilted lettuce. But it was his eyes that really told the story. Sebastian had always had this swagger, this confidence that radiated from him like heat from a bonfire. Even when he was failing spectacularly, even when his latest business venture was circling the drain, he'd maintained this unshakable belief that everything would work out because he was Sebastian Wells, and things always worked out for Sebastian Wells. Now, looking at him standing in my doorway like a lost tourist asking for directions, that swagger was nowhere to be found. "Hey," he said, and his voice cracked like he was 13 years old again and going through puberty. "Got a minute?" I gestured to the chair across from my desk, the same chair where clients and contractors came to beg for extensions or negotiate deals or grovel for second chances. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of us. Sebastian, the guy who'd spent his entire adult life assuming he'd be sitting behind this desk someday, was now on the other side of it, hat in hand, looking for a favor. "What can I do for you?" I asked, maintaining the kind of professional politeness I'd use with any random person who'd wandered into my office. No warmth, no family recognition, just business courtesy. After 30 years of being treated like the help while Sebastian got the royal treatment, I figured he could get a taste of what neutral felt like. Sebastian started, then stopped, looking around the office like he was seeing it for the first time. His eyes lingered on the family photos on my desk, the awards and certificates on the walls, the project blueprints spread out on the conference table. This was the inner sanctum he'd always assumed would be his birthright, and now he was seeing it as an outsider looking in. "I need a job," he finally managed, and the words came out like he was confessing to a crime. "I know things have been complicated between us, but I was hoping maybe we could work something out. I've got experience, I know the business, I could be valuable to the team." I had to bite my lip to keep from bursting out laughing. Sebastian Wells, the man who'd spent years telling people he was going to revolutionize the construction industry through synergistic innovation and disruptive business models, was sitting in my office begging for a job like any other unemployed schmuck. The golden boy who'd thought he was too good for actual work was now desperate enough to come crawling to the brother he'd spent decades looking down on. "Experience," I said, leaning forward with the kind of fake interest you'd show a small child explaining their imaginary friend. "What kind of experience would that be, exactly? Because I've been going through our records, and I'm having trouble finding any actual projects you've managed, or deals you've closed, or clients you've brought in. Maybe you could refresh my memory." Sebastian's face went through more color changes than a mood ring having an identity crisis. The remnants of his fake tan couldn't hide the fact that he was turning red with embarrassment, then pale with realization, then some kind of greenish color that suggested he might actually be sick to his stomach. "Look," he said, abandoning any pretense of confidence and going straight into desperation mode. "I know I made mistakes. I know I wasn't always as hands-on as I should have been. But I'm family. Dad always said family takes care of family. Dad said a lot of things," I replied, enjoying every second of this conversation. "He also said that business is business, and family is family, and smart people know the difference. He taught me that actions matter more than intentions, results matter more than promises, and work matters more than connections." I paused for dramatic effect, the same way Harrison had at the will reading. "So tell me, Sebastian, what exactly have you been doing for work since the will reading?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Sebastian squirmed in his chair, looking everywhere except directly at me, probably trying to figure out how to spin his recent unemployment into something that sounded professional and voluntary rather than desperate and pathetic. "I've been exploring options," he said finally, which was Sebastian speak for, "I've been sitting around feeling sorry for myself while reality slowly dawned on me. The market's been challenging, you know? A lot of companies are restructuring, looking for different skill sets. What he means, I thought to myself, is that nobody wants to hire a guy whose only qualifications are looking good in a suit and talking about synergy." But I didn't say that out loud. Instead, I just sat there, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Watching Sebastian realize that this conversation wasn't going the way he'd hoped it would. 6 months after the Great Will Reading apocalypse, I was living in what could only be described as a parallel universe where everything finally made sense. It's funny how quickly life can flip from tragedy to comedy when you're no longer the punchline of everyone else's jokes. Every morning, I'd wake up in my new house, a beautiful craftsman-style place in the hills with actual character, unlike the cookie-cutter McMansion Amanda had insisted we buy, and remember that I was no longer married to a woman who treated me like a participation trophy or working for a family that treated me like unpaid help. The view from my home office window showed the city spread out below, like a construction project I was finally allowed to manage properly. Timberline construction had grown more in 6 months under my leadership than it had in the previous 3 years of Sebastian's visionary guidance. We'd landed 4 major contracts, expanded our crew by 30%, and actually started making the kind of money that Dad had always dreamed about, but never quite achieved while he was trying to balance between rewarding Sebastian's ego and maintaining the business. But the real entertainment came from watching Sebastian's spectacular descent from golden boy to cautionary tale. The man who'd strutted around Portland like he owned the place was now working at a car dealership on McLaughlin Boulevard, wearing a polyester uniform with his name embroidered on the pocket and a smile so forced it looked like someone had used a staple gun to attach it to his face. I'd driven by a couple of times, purely for research purposes, you understand, and watching him try to sell used Hondas to soccer moms while maintaining what was left of his dignity was better than any sitcom that had ever been produced. The house that Sebastian had been so confident he was inheriting? Yeah, that got sold to cover his debts. Turns out those business expenses Uncle Jerry had mentioned were even more extensive than anyone had realized. Sebastian had managed to rack up credit card debt that would make a small country envious, including charges for networking events in places like Dubai and the French Riviera. Apparently, maintaining the illusion of success is expensive when you're funding it entirely through borrowed money and family guilt. Amanda, my dear ex-wife who'd thought she was trading up from a Toyota to a Tesla, discovered that she'd actually downgraded to a bicycle with a flat tire. The divorce that she'd initiated so confidently, expecting to walk away with half of a construction empire, ended up netting her half of absolutely nothing plus half responsibility for Sebastian's debts. There's a special kind of justice in watching someone who treated marriage like a stock portfolio discover that they'd bet everything on Enron right before it collapsed. The family dynamics had shifted so completely that I sometimes felt like I was living in someone else's life. Aunt Marge, who'd spent decades treating me like furniture while fawning over Sebastian, now called me twice a week to tell me how proud she was and how she'd always known I was the smart one. Uncle Jerry, who'd been Sebastian's biggest cheerleader and financial enabler, now acted like he'd been team protagonist all along, conveniently forgetting every conversation we'd ever had about Sebastian's natural leadership abilities. Diane, my stepmother, had executed a complete personality transplant that would have impressed a witness protection specialist. The woman who'd spent years insisting that Sebastian was destined for greatness now talked about how she'd always worried about his decision-making and how she'd hoped he'd learn to be more like me. The speed with which she rewrote history was actually impressive from a creative writing standpoint, even if it was morally bankrupt from a human decency perspective. Every time I signed a new contract or saw my name on the office door, I couldn't help but laugh. Not the bitter, frustrated laugh of someone who's been wronged, but the deep, satisfied laugh of someone who's finally gotten to see karma deliver a masterclass in poetic justice. Dad had orchestrated this whole thing like a chess master planning 20 moves ahead, and I was just now beginning to appreciate the full scope of his strategy. The business was thriving in ways that would have been impossible under Sebastian's leadership. Our clients actually trusted us now because they were dealing with someone who understood the difference between a load-bearing wall and a partition, someone who could read blueprints without needing a translator, someone who showed up to job sites in work clothes instead of designer suits that cost more than most people's monthly salary. The Morrison Hotel project that I'd salvaged while Sebastian was networking in Cabo had led to 3 more hotel renovations. The Peterson contract that I'd saved during Dad's illness had resulted in ongoing relationships with the city's planning department. The waterfront development that Sebastian had tried to take credit for had opened doors with investors who were looking for reliable contractors instead of smooth-talking salesmen. But my absolute favorite part of this whole transformation was the day Sebastian finally swallowed what was left of his pride and applied for a job at Timberline. Not as a consultant or a partner or any kind of executive position, but as a regular employee, willing to start at whatever level I deemed appropriate. The man who'd spent his entire adult life assuming he'd inherit a construction empire was desperate enough to beg for entry-level work from the brother he'd always treated like the help. I turned him down, of course, not out of spite. Well, maybe a little out of spite, but because Sebastian working for me would have been bad for both of us. He would have spent every day resenting his fall from grace, and I would have spent every day waiting for him to sabotage something important out of wounded pride. Better to let him find his own path, even if that path led to a car lot where his biggest decision was whether to include floor mats in the financing package. The laughter hadn't stopped since that day in Harrison's office when the truth finally came out. Every success, every new contract, every time someone called me Mr. Wells with actual respect instead of confused obligation, I remembered the look on Sebastian's face when he realized that the family business had never actually been his to inherit. Dad had set the stage perfectly, letting everyone believe whatever they wanted to believe while quietly arranging for merit to finally triumph over mythology. And the best part? The comedy show was still running, with new episodes every day as Sebastian adjusted to his new reality, and I enjoyed mine.